All right, guys, I have 6:30 straight up, at least on one of my clocks. Well, I am glad y'all are with us tonight. I'm pretty excited about tonight's class, and I hope you will be too. It's very different than what we've been doing for the last several months, but I'm kind of hoping maybe to get away from some of our hardcore gardening topics and maybe just have a little fun with some of our landscaping and Appalachian natives and things like that as we move through tonight and then into the month of October. And hopefully y'all have had time in the last few weeks to put your gardens to bed for the winter, and you've had an opportunity to do some of that soil testing we've talked about, and maybe get a cover crop sown on your gardens or your raised beds and all that good stuff. So again, hopefully tonight will just be more about relaxing and settling in and learning about the oldest mountain range here in the United States. So I've had a few people ask me, you know, why we are talking about the mountains per se in a horticulture class. And so trying to tie all that together, you know, we remember that horticulture is the art and science of producing, using, and marketing plants, but it's all about science and aesthetics. And then all that goes back to knowing our environment, right? So it's all about planting that the right plant in the right place, if you will. So again, understanding our environment, no matter where we are, whether we're in Ohio or Georgia, New York, or right here in Northeast Tennessee, the climate and the temperature, rainfall, all of those things are going to affect what we can grow successfully, or what, you know, some of those plants that we can kind of cheat on and be a little successful with. Some of us are going to be on the cusp of some of those things, but understanding some of that topography is really going to help us maybe put it all into a better sequence. So tonight we're going to look at a lot of maps, but hopefully that's just going to help you understand your location, your environment a little bit better. And this term physiography, which is just physical geography, just looking at some similar terrain, rock types, the geological structure, and history. So a lot of tonight is going to be focused a little bit more on the historical components, because let me just go ahead and put this out there. I'm not a geologist. I'm not a geographer, if that's a technical word for that. I'm not an Appalachian history studies major or anything like that. But I grew up in the Southern Appalachians, and I've called it home pretty much my entire life, and anytime I was away, I was always anxious to get back. And as I've gotten older, I look at those, the history of how people have really influenced our region, you know, taking it all the way back to our Native Americans all the way up to present day. And, you know, we all leave a little piece of ourselves, and we pass that along for those generations to come. So in essence, that's kind of what we're going to spend a lot of our focus on, and just kind of getting us acquainted with the Appalachians. And because a lot of October is going to be talking about some of those native woodland plants and wildflowers. You know, many of you have joined us with the spring wildflowers, so just kind of get more acquainted with our area. So we have to start out with how we say Appalachian. I've already been saying Appalachian, so y'all know where I'm coming from. I have a good friend, many colleagues, you know, they know I'm getting geared up to do this class, and especially some of those up in New England states, they call it Appalachian. And so we get into, you know, just kind of joking with one another all the time. And some of my friends, when Walk in the Woods was first released, we were so excited to watch that, you know, because what's his name, Robert Redford and Nick Nolte. But the second Nick Nolte said Appalachian, we were like, oh, he's not from around here, is he? But it doesn't matter how you pronounce it. It's all the same. It all encompasses this region that many of us call home. So, of course, when we do talk about the Appalachian Range, a lot of folks don't realize that it does, in fact, extend all the way up into Newfoundland, into Canada, the New Brunswick area. Oftentimes here in the U.S., we'll leave those portions out and not talk about that, but they do really encompass a great portion of this Appalachian Range, and definitely worth the mention. But when we do talk about the Appalachian region, or sometimes Appalachia, this is the area here in red that most often we're going to refer to, whether you're approaching it from a historical, geological, or geographical context. This is often what we refer to. Now, my friend Bill is on here, and he called me out on this Friday when I sent the agenda out about the Catskills and Poconos. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that area later in some of these geographic regions, but just kind of pay close attention to where that red area is, because we're going to hit on some of those as we move through tonight. And like I said, I'm going to share a lot of maps with you, and you're going to have these as a reference point. But again, I just want you to really look at this and see what all our native range does encompass. So the Appalachian Range is going to extend about 2,000 miles, again from Newfoundland in Canada all the way down into Alabama. Depending on where we're at, it's going to be 100 to 300 miles wide. And you can probably notice here by either one of these pictures that the Appalachians serve as a natural barrier between the coastal plain area and then the interior lowlands of the United States, which could be an impediment for travel years ago. You'll hear me talk about that a little bit more. Notice again, we see the Appalachians extending into even these islands off the coast of Newfoundland that are actually French territory. So Appalachians are really touching a lot of different cultures all across the globe, actually. It's kind of cool. So the Appalachians formed about 480 million years ago. They reached heights that were similar to our modern day Rockies or the Alps, but just due to natural erosion over time, that's why we see those rounded tops more so than the sharp jagged edges of the Rockies or the Alps. And again, you'll notice that you see a lot of these different mountain ranges. I put this map on here just so you could see some of the different sub-ranges within the Appalachian Range. And these are the ones we're going to spend some time focusing on. But you can tell the Appalachian Range as the spine of that runs up the coast. Again, it does serve as a barrier, and it did serve as an impetus for Western travel years ago, because a lot of the cross ridges and the folds within these mountains. So before we get really deep into it, I did want to mention about the rocks. The rocks within the core of the Appalachian Mountains are proven to be about 1 billion years old. And that was when all the continents were joined together in one big land mass. And the cool thing about this, if you're a rock nerd, as I call, you can see some of that exposed rock in areas throughout the Appalachians. This here is a picture of Blowing Rock in North Carolina. And then if we have any Georgia folks on here, this is Red Top Mountain in North Georgia. So you can actually see some of that exposed rock. That too goes along with gneiss rock, G-N-E-I-S-S. That's a metamorphic type rock. Metamorphic, of course, just means, meta means change and morph means form. So it's basically, it was just a rock that was recrystallizing under intense heat and pressure when the mountain chain was forming. So we have a lot of that makes up the Appalachians, especially in the central and southern Appalachians. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that. I put some links in there for you so you can go and read up on that if you are what I call my sister a rock nerd. She was always collecting rocks as a young child. Want to make mention of a few other mountain ranges. The Ouachita Mountains, which are in Arkansas, right outside Little Rock, that extend into Oklahoma, were once considered to be part of the Appalachian Range, but have actually been proven geologically not to be similar. So they are not part of that Appalachian Range. The same thing with the Adirondacks. A lot of people think that those are Appalachian, and this is actually taken from Lake Champlain, looking back toward the Adirondacks there in New York. But the Adirondacks are the only mountain chain in the eastern U.S. that is its own geological landform. They are not tied to the Appalachians at all. So that's one of your little tidbits for the night. And again, you can kind of see that range in the distance. The really cool thing about the Appalachians is they didn't start out right here on the eastern seaboard of the United States. They actually got their start kind of all mushed together. They were once an extension of the Caledonian Mountains, and that is a mountain chain now in Scotland and Scandinavia. You can kind of see there again, Scotland. You can kind of see how the Appalachians here kind of formed. And then, of course, the anti-Atlas Mountains in Africa were also part of the Appalachian Range, which is really unique, and the Scottish Highlands. So all of those at one time were just one big mountain range, and at one time when all of these continents were together, you could walk from New York into Morocco or from Florida over to Sierra Leone. So geologically speaking, very similar mountain ranges. And this one kind of shows you a little bit better. When all the continents were forced together, that's why we have a lot of those folded mountains. So it's basically like taking two pieces of cardboard and forcing them together, and you get all those folds, all those zigzags. That's one reason we have all those cross sections and all those alternating ridge lines within the Appalachians, or within those anti-Atlas mountains. And again, just to kind of show you where this is, it's not far off the coast. Here is the Cape Verde Islands, where all those great hurricanes are forming and coming to us. I didn't even realize we were on beta until last night, y'all. So kind of crazy hurricane season. But this kind of shows you what those folds look like. This is in the anti-Atlas mountains of Morocco, because of course our vegetation is going to be different. So we can't, even from an aerial view, always be able to see what those folds and crevices look like. But that kind of shows you a little bit better. So this right here is actually Ben Nevis in the Scottish Highlands. So you can kind of see some of the similarities there. When we talk about the Appalachian Range here in the U.S., again, we talk about several sub-ranges that make up this one big range, the northern, central, and the southern. We're going to talk about a few of those in each one of these. And you'll notice I have the Catskills, the Poconos, and the Adirondacks kind of floating down there, because we do have some discrepancy there as where they lay. We've already talked about Adirondacks. They're their own freestanding form. But as far as the Catskills and the Poconos, they are in central, but a lot of folks also classify them southern, because that's where the Blue Ridge sub-range actually starts. So a lot of people want to lump the entire Blue Ridge chain into the southern Appalachian system. And we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about that in a few minutes. But the Catskills, of course, are in New York and extend down into those Poconos, and that's kind of where the Allegheny Plateau and the Great Appalachian Valley starts. So that's another reason they're oftentimes going to be lumped into the southern Appalachians as well. So we'll start out in Newfoundland. This is actually the Long Range Mountains. You can see the scenery there. It's just absolutely beautiful, very prolific with wildflowers, of course, often covered with snow mass most of the months there. The Aniotchsquatch Mountains are also there. A lot of good skiing locations to be seen. You can see how steep, pretty magnificent views scattered all throughout the Newfoundland territory there. This is actually a picture taken at the Grossmoor National Park. So this would be the tip of Nova Scotia, where you can actually ride the ferry into St. John's or Port aux Basques, either one. I wouldn't recommend trying to drive this in one day. It's a really lengthy drive. But Grossmoor does offer some spectacular views, and you're going to get a lot of that Irish Gaelic looking feel. These are the Chic-Choc Mountains, and they're going to look really similar to the Notre Dame Range in Quebec. Again, going to be known for their skiing. Many people don't realize that the Cape Breton Highlands are actually all part of the Appalachian Range. You can kind of see here how the Atlantic influences this eastern shore, and then you have the St. Lawrence Bay on this side. So pretty cool, because you get a lot of Gaelic influence on this side of the island compared to the Acadian, the French Acadian on this side. So really cool mesh of the cultures there as well. And you can kind of see some of what the scenery there looks like. This is actually Lockheed's Point, right on the tip, kind of where the Atlantic and the St. Lawrence Bay meet. And then this is taken from that Skyline Trail on the Acadian side overlooking St. Lawrence Bay. So this is only an elevation of about 2,200 foot. That's why they call it the Highland area. But a beautiful area to explore. And then as we move on down into Maine, this is actually a range called the Longfellows. They were named after the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He was born in Maine. This is going to be home to Baxter State Park and Mount Katahdin, probably two of the most prominent peaks in that range. Of course, Mount Katahdin is going to be that northern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. And you can see there standing atop Katahdin overlooking the valley floor. This is going to be that terminus after what most hikers call the 100-mile wilderness, of seeing nothing and nobody for 100 miles. As we move on further south, we enter into New Hampshire, into what we call the White Mountains. Many of you have probably heard of those. There used to be a lot of discrepancy between the eastern seaboard's highest point, between the Whites, or Mount Washington, and Mount Mitchell. This is actually taken from the top of Mount Washington. You can kind of see there, you're overlooking the clouds. You can also see the terrain. It's very rugged and steep. Just 1,000 foot below that, you have the beautiful evergreens and even the hardwoods. You start your hike on a day that you're wet from just hiking in the clouds, but then when you make it to the top, you're rewarded with a spectacular view. And again, you can see that presidential range. It's known as some of the toughest country on the eastern seaboard, just because of the climate can just change so quickly. And then alternately, when you're looking across from the Whites, you see the Green Mountains in Vermont. So Burlington, Vermont is going to be known for the Green Mountains. This is actually taken from atop Mount Mansfield, which is the highest point in Vermont, looking back toward the White Mountain Range. And then that's a view of Mount Mansfield itself from somewhere outside of Burlington. And this map just kind of shows you how that comes together. So Lake Champlain would be here, and of course this is all the Appalachian Range, but then this is the Adirondacks here into New York. So close, but yet so geologically different. As you move on further south into Massachusetts, which is this is the Berkshires, or the Berkshire Hills, and this is just an extension of the Green Mountains in Vermont. You have a lot of those gentle rolling hills. Sometimes you'll hear in Connecticut, because they do extend a little bit further south into Connecticut, you'll hear that called the Litchfield Hills area, and kind of see where this area falls in or comes into play here. So now as we move out of that northern section, we come into the central section, and from all accounts, even I did take an Appalachian Studies class, believe it or not, years ago in undergrad, and even in talking with him, this is the area that's most hard to define, just because there's so much going on, and you can see it from this map. But basically, the central region is going to extend from that Hudson River Valley all the way down to the New River Valley. And the New River Valley, of course, is the Kanawha River there. The Kanawha River's formed from the New and the Gauley there in West Virginia. But this is where that Allegheny Plateau, the Great Appalachian Valley is going to be. This plateau is going to extend all the way down. Shirley, I think, is on here, close to Clydeland Canyon. So that's all going to encompass part of that plateau, which is all part of the Appalachians there. This is actually taken just about an hour outside of New York City. This is looking at the skyline. It's kind of blurry, but this is in, I don't know how you say that, Ramapo State Park. It's in that New Jersey Highlands area. So,
Ramapo. Okay,
thank you very much. You don't have to, you're not very far from the city to be able to see that, but again, the elevation is not going to be quite as high as what we see in the Whites or in the Southern Appalachians. And you can kind of see how that's broken out in the Hudson Highlands and then in the Jersey Highlands. This here is a picture of the Taconic Mountains, and a lot of, again, the Native American tribes influenced a lot of the names. This was one, the Algonquins named it Taconic because it actually meant tree or wood or forest. So the Taconics are a sub-range that are going to run along that eastern border of New York and then northwest Connecticut into parts of Massachusetts. And I put this little schematic up just to show you New York, again, where the Catskills are and that Allegheny Plateau starts. Again, that's another reason that a lot of people will lump that into the southern, because they want to capture the Blue Ridge or that plateau all into into the southern. But when we do refer to Appalachia, oftentimes this is going to be that northern border of what we term Appalachia. Many of you probably recognize this as the New River Bridge right outside, I think it's Fayetteville, West Virginia. This is lies within that great Appalachian Valley that you've heard me talk about. That's probably one of the best known features, that entire valley known within the Appalachian Valley itself. You can see that gorge just cut out through there. You can see how far that valley does in fact extend. So like for us here in Northeast Tennessee, the Holston River Valley, the Tennessee River Valley, or the Catoosa on further south, all of those are going to be part of that valley chain. The way I always try to illustrate that is I tell people when I leave my home in Jonesboro and travel north on Interstate 81 up through Virginia, I know everything I'm looking at on my right, especially once I make it to Roanoke, mile marker 150, everything to my right is going to be the Blue Ridge, everything to my left is going to be the Alleghanies. And you're just basically riding right up that great valley on Interstate 81. And you can see there in Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley is listed there. And again, just to make reference to that plateau again, because we're going to talk about some of the features that are kind of embedded within some of these microdomes, but you can see how that extends down into Alabama there. And just a view from the Blue Ridge Parkway overlooking the Shenandoah Valley. It won't be long and we'll start seeing those color changes. So then we come into the Southern Appalachians. And again, it's one of those things, I guess, maybe living here and growing up here, working here, what do you pick and choose to talk about in the Southern Appalachian? But the cool thing is this is basically where that Blue Ridge chain, there's like this prolongation of the chain. So Mary Forbes said it right a few minutes ago. She said she lived in the Unaka Mountain Range of Northeast Tennessee. So there is that eastern front and then the western front. So you have the Unakas and basically the Smoky Mountains kind of split apart in this area. This is the chimney tops, which are in the Great Smoky Mountains. Some of you may recognize the chimney tops. This was where the Great Fire started a few years ago. When was that? Back in 2016, I think. This is right below Clingman's Dome within the Great Smoky Mountains. And I don't really have this in here, but I don't think I do. If I do, you'll just have to see it twice, I guess. But the cool thing about the chimney tops, which is kind of an extension, there's another mountain peak called Charlie's Bunyan. And then if anybody's familiar with Clingman's Dome, you know, once you get to the summit, you can look down on Fontana Lake in North Carolina. And anyway, there's what they call the road to nowhere down there. But the cool thing about the chimney tops is that there's this anakista rock that we see. And once it combines with water, it creates sulfuric acid. So that's one reason that the road to nowhere was halted in Bryson City, North Carolina. That's one reason you see a lot of we do have the pine bark beetle and a lot of other critters that caused a lot of damage, but we also had a little bit higher occurrence of acid rain, the ozone, in some of these areas. We've got a lot of big summits that reside within the Blue Ridge. This is at the top of the Beauty Spot in Irwin, Tennessee. This is right on the North Carolina-Tennessee line, which again is what that Unaka front is known for. It pretty much straddles that line. You can see that's actually looking out on the Appalachian Trail there. And you can see how some of those cross sections actually do occur, which does make travel a little tough. This is Grandfather Mountain. You can see the face of the old man there. It's probably one of the most photographed mountains in East Tennessee, Western North Carolina. But this is where we have a lot of the sub-ranges fall, the craggy mountains, and so aptly named because this is a very craggy mountain. If anybody's ever been to Grandfather, you can see how rocky those summits are. And instead of hiking, you're actually climbing and using ladders built on the side of the rock cliff to climb that. The Great Balsam Mountains, the Plot Balsams, of course the Black Mountains are all going to fall within this range. I got ahead of myself. Cold Mountain, if anybody ever watched that movie, there is a real cold mountain in western North Carolina in the Balsam Mountain range. The movie, of course, was filmed in Romania, but anyway, the true cold mountain does exist. The Highlands of the Rhone, or Rhone Mountain, is very well known in the western Unaka front. This is the Rhone Highlands. It kind of serves as a bridge, as one of those cross bridges to the Black Mountain Range, which then goes straight across into the Smoky Ridge line. It's hard to show all that with just little pictures here, but extending off this Rhone, which there are several balds, we actually have the Bald Mountain Range. So there's about 14 or 15 bald summits that are going to fall within that range, and we'll talk a little bit more about what those are in a few minutes. This is taken along the Blue Ridge Parkway at its southern terminus, Plot Balsam, highest elevation on the parkway, looking back toward Water Rock Knob. Okay, so that kind of finishes us up for the three sections, and we're going to shift gears a little bit. So, and get into some more fun stuff in some of the floral provinces and stuff. So, the cool thing about Appalachia is that it's not always been called Appalachia. It was often called Alleghania. And we were almost close to being called the Allegheny. I mean, there is the Allegheny Mountains, but that's a sub-range. But the entire chain was almost called the Allegheny Mountain Range. But it was Washington Irving, even in the 19th century, that proposed naming the United States Appalachia or Alleghenia. So that's just another cool tidbit. But it was in the 19th century that they finally decided on Appalachia. And again, just a map so you can kind of see where we're at there. DeSoto wasn't technically the one that named the Appalachian Ridge. We often hear that in history books, but it was the Narvaez expedition that actually found, I don't know if you can see this, it was a Native American village in modern day Tallahassee, actually called the Appalachia. But it was when DeSoto and them came through that they actually put the Spanish twist on it, and thus we were left with Appalachian, which is what we still call it today, just spelled a little differently. Another interesting fact is that Appalachian is the fourth oldest surviving European place name in the United States, and all that means is that a lot of the place names here in the United States were brought to us from European colonies that first populated the United States. You've heard me mention the Native American tribes several times. These were very instrumental in helping shape the area. You can see kind of where they fall within the Appalachian Range. Cherokee, probably one of the most prominent, the eastern band of the Cherokee on the Qualla boundary there in western North Carolina. The Chickasaws, the Choctaw and the Creek, all in the southern Appalachians, all the way up to the Powhatan and the Delaware. Of course, Iroquois, of which the Wampanoag, or where we get the Three Sisters Garden, and then the Abenaki and Algonquins. So all of those really helped influence a lot of the culture and some of the medicinal plant uses and things that we're going to talk about in late October. So you'll get to see how they put their spin on things. And just a map of all the tribal nations that you can refer back to. The cool thing about the Appalachians, again, we're broke down into those sub-ranges, but within those we have many national forest lands that do exist. So if we're here in East Tennessee, of course, we have the Cherokee National Forest, and then our border state, our border sister there is the Pisgah National Forest, and a lot of times those run together. You can see several of those others from Talladega in Alabama all the way up to Monongahela in West Virginia. Of course, the most visited state national park in the United States is here in the Appalachians, the Great Smokies. Shenandoah is not too far behind that. And of course, we've got the Blue Ridge Parkway, the Cumberland Gap, and then the Appalachian Footpath and the Blue Ridge National Heritage Trail. So a lot going on for outdoor enthusiasts within the Appalachian chain. You've heard me mention Mount Mitchell a couple of times. This is the highest peak east of the Mississippi River. The cool thing about all of these mountains, I guess in the Appalachian Ridges, is that we have close to 1,900 peaks that are named. And once we get into the southern Appalachian, we have 125 peaks that are actually over 5,000 feet, which is pretty pretty cool for these highly eroded mountains. But this is Mount Mitchell, just north of Asheville, North Carolina, not far from the Tennessee state line. Interestingly enough, the fellow that named Mount Mitchell, Dr. Alicia Mitchell, was trying to prove that Mount Mitchell was in fact the highest peak and fell off the mountain and died. So that's one reason he has the name, but he proved that it was the highest peak over Clingman's Dome and Mount Craig. So this is standing at the top, at the summit, and you can look back toward Asheville, and way back in the distance you can see the Smoky Ridge line. So again, Mount Mitchell is a part of the Black Mountain Range within the Blue Ridge subrange. So again, just illustrating how these folds and the cross sections occur within these mountains. They just kind of crisscross one another, and this is just a good example of that. Just to make mention of Mount Mitchell, if you're traveling there, it's on the Blue Ridge Parkway. That's the only access unless you're going by foot. So it's often closed in the winter months. Mount Craig is going to be the second highest peak in the eastern U.S., so right there next to each other. And again, when we were standing at Mount Mitchell, we were looking toward that Smokies Ridge line. So on a clear day, you can see Clingman's Dome from Mount Mitchell. So this would be looking back toward the Black Mountain Range. But this is the third highest peak, right on the North Carolina-Tennessee line. You can see how the vegetation is, different with the spruce fir forest. I was talking about Fontana Lake. It lies off to the right of this picture here. So for those of you that want to know what each of the highest peaks are, I put a slide in there for you so you can see what those are. We'd be remiss to talk about Appalachia and not talk about waterfalls, but the cool thing about waterfalls is that they're a little bit different in the northern Appalachians versus here in the southern Appalachians. So in the northern Appalachians, we had a lot of glacier activity. So if you've attended some of my classes on soils and things before, you've heard me talk about non-glaciated alluvial type soils. So non-glaciated means that we didn't have glaciers here. So even in the southern App, or anywhere pretty much below that Mason-Dixon line, we didn't have glacier activity, but glaciers affected a lot of our topography, the terrain, and a lot of the biological species that we still see today. But waterfalls are another one of those prominent features. So if you can kind of see, this is actually on Little Wilson Falls on the Appalachian Trail in Maine. One of the distinct differences are these ledges. And that's because when those glaciers come down and took all that debris with them, and it just kind of scraped off the tops of these mountains, it was kind of left with this solidified shelf line. So the water had to go somewhere, so it flowed over these terraces. Whereas in the southern Appalachians, and this is right on the North Carolina, South Carolina line outside of Cashiers, North Carolina. This is the Whitewater River, Whitewater Falls. So the headwaters are not that far from here. And right next door is the Horse Pasture River. And they basically flow into Lake Jocassee and then flow on out to form the Savannah River. So that's another geography lesson for tonight. But the waterfalls here, they just were formed by the action of water on soft rock versus hard rock. And it just kind of kept alternating. So that's one reason we see a lot of that smooth rock versus some of those rugged ledge type falls that we see in the northern section. Again, not many rivers can lay claim to the fact that they're older than the mountains for which they rise, and this is another picture of that New River Bridge, because the New River is actually rumored to be the second oldest river in the world, it follows the Nile. There's still discrepancies on that, trying to prove that theory. But basically when these mountains were pushed together and then they were thrust up, it basically blocked the westward course of some of these rivers from flowing out. So when we talk about gorges and narrows and canyons, a lot of that was just due to these rivers trying to find an outlet, thus the New River. And again, you can kind of see it flowing through there before it meets the Gauley and forms the Kanawha there in West Virginia. Just one more mention of the glacier activity. Again, they left a lot of remnants behind that we still see today, but The red squirrels and some of this creeping juniper are some of those things. And again, we'll talk more about that in October, but basically it was almost like a seed bed for some of that glacier activity. So, you know, the Great Smokies has been touted for being very biologically diverse, and that's one of the reasons. So even though we didn't have the glaciers, we still had remnants of the glacier activity here. Another cool thing within the Appalachians is this fossil reef. This is Chazy Fossil Reef. It's the oldest known fossil reef in the world. This is actually on Isle Lamont in the middle of Lake Champlain. So it was an extension from Newfoundland and all the way down to the Cumberland Plateau in Tennessee is how far it extended. So Isle Lamont, an island in the middle of Lake Champlain, 170 miles from the Atlantic Ocean, has some of the best depictions of fossils of anywhere else on the planet. So a lot of trilobites, and if you're into the fossils, this is going to be one of the greatest places to be able to see some of that activity. Of course, also coal is in them there hills. You've heard that saying before. There's a lot of coal mining still active today. We've got proof that the Hopi Indians were using coal all the way back in the 1300s. So if you're interested in the coal history, there is the Coal Heritage Trail in West Virginia. There's also one in Virginia that takes you through the history of that. There's different kinds of coal. I don't claim to be an expert on those, but there's anthracite coal, which is the hard coal. You have the bituminous coal, which is a soft coal, which is a little bit, there's a little bit more money in that. Also, coal is going to be found in the eastern Kentucky coal fields, Ohio, Pennsylvania, several of those areas as well. If you've never seen a coal seam, you can see some of these even traveling into eastern Kentucky. Pretty cool to be able to see that. As well as remnants from other minerals that the Appalachians have housed. This was an iron furnace in Estill County, Kentucky. A lot of these iron furnaces still around. We have several of those even right here in Greene and Washington County, down off Clarks Creek. The Burra Burra copper mine right outside of Ducktown. Very instrumental in copper mining back in the day. Of course, the steel mills of Pennsylvania. This was Jones and Laughlin Steel Mill. They really helped put Pennsylvania on the map years ago. And then the Alcoa aluminum, still in existence today, just south of Knoxville. So a lot of these ores and minerals still mined and used today. Natural gas and oil was also discovered in the mountains. This is the Drake well of Venango County, Pennsylvania. So it's about 70 foot deep, and this was basically the well that sparked the first oil boom in the United States. You've heard me mention several times about the Atlantic Mountain Range being the Atlantic Mountain Range, listen to me, the Appalachian Mountain Range serving as that barrier to the Atlantic Ocean. And indeed, the Continental Divide pretty much travels the entire length of the Appalachian Mountains in some form. So you can see that Eastern Continental Divide here, and then the St. Lawrence Divide that encompasses the northern part. So basically anything to the right flows to the ocean, and anything to the left goes to the Mississippi and on to the Gulf. And of course, before we get into some of these biodomes, the Appalachian Footpath, again, 2,200 miles there. There is an international Appalachian Trail that does extend on into Canada from Katahdin, Maine. Now it goes all the way to Newfoundland. So when we do talk about the Appalachian Mountain Range, there's a lot of different biomes that we refer to. So one of the most known, again, is this temperate rainforest. A lot of people don't realize that within the Great Smokies we do in fact have this temperate rainforest. That area is going to receive about 60 inches of rainfall a year. It's going to encompass about 135,000 square miles within the southern Appalachian chain, especially again the Great Smokies. The spruce fir forest is going to be considered a temperate rainforest as well, especially, of course, those higher elevations on the North Carolina-Tennessee line. Again, noted to be one of the great floral provinces of the earth. It's very complex. You got about 10,000 species that make their home just here in the southern Appalachian. And it's not to take anything away from the northern sections of the Appalachian Mountains. It's just that when, again, the activity left from some of that glacier activity, it just pretty much deposited everything in the southern Appalachians, and we were left with a great species of many different flora and fauna. So this is the Appalachian Blue Ridge Forest. This is going to be well known in the southern Appalachians, even extending out of Pennsylvania. But that's just a lot of your temperate mixed forest, your hardwoods. You've got to have a lot of species. The chestnut was one that used to thrive in this area. We don't see that anymore because of the blight at the turn of the century. But again, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote many poems about the chestnut. He often said that the chestnut inspired him. And the chestnuts, were a great tree to the early pioneers that settled the region. And of course, it did serve as a food source. It was good. It was a good mast for wildlife as well as human consumption as well. The Appalachian bog, this is something a lot of people don't realize right here in East Tennessee. It used to be a large production area for cranberries. There was about 10,000 acres in cranberries, just right up on the Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee line. So they're not just grown in Massachusetts, y'all. They were in fact grown in Shady Valley, Tennessee. So the Nature Conservancy has come in and initiated a bog restoration. But oftentimes within the southern Appalachians, you'll hear these called fens, F-E-N, rather than a bog, but it is a true bog. The Appalachian coves are pretty well notorious all throughout the Appalachian range. You're going to see a lot of these coves that have been preserved in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Cades Cove probably being one of the most popular, and Cataloochee Cove on the North Carolina side, and then of course Greenbrier on the Cosby side. So basically a cove is a small valley between two ridge lines. So it can be closed at one end, or it can be closed in at both ends. Like Cataloochee would be a cove that's closed in at both ends. Probably a lot of road names you hear called cove. If you're close to Erwin, Tennessee here, you've heard Bumpus Cove. So a lot of different coves. Tuckaleechee Cove, Miller Cove, a lot of those in the Smokies. If you are in Virginia, Burke's Garden, in the Jefferson Washington National Forest, that would also be termed a cove. To go with the coves, you've got the cove forest. This is a lot of those old growth forests. That's where we're going to see a lot of those hardwood species, the beech, the redbuds, the silver bells. You're going to have the big trees, the oaks and the maples, as well as a lot of those understory trees too. Even your mountain laurels, rhododendrons, all of those are going to fall in here. Your hickory trees, any of those food and nut trees. This is another area that's going to be well developed in the Smokies region. There's about 72,000 acres there of old growth forest. And of course, you've got the mixed mesotypic forest. You're going to have some of those evergreens like the hemlocks. Of course, you're going to see damage from that hemlock woolly adelgid on a lot of those evergreen species. We're starting to see a little bit of a bounce back, but at one time it almost decimated some of these populations. Of course, within this group, you're also going to see the floor covered with ginseng and golden seal. In the springtime, you're going to see those spring ephemerals like the trilliums. They just pretty much cover the entire forest floor. A lot of the orchids, the native orchids, again, just a very diverse ecosystem in the southern Appalachians. So very fortunate to be able to see all those species. The Appalachians, again, are known for the balds, both heath and grassy balds. Of course, those heath balds are going to have any kind of like blueberry, sumac, any of those low-growing shrubs. Even the Catawba rhododendrons along the Rhone would be considered a heath bald. And then you've got those grassy balds that are pretty popular in the southern Appalachians, like the Beauty Spot and Max Patch being some of the more famous. But also when you get into the southern App in the Smokies, you've got Gregory bald and Andrews bald, all of those. So a lot of these are do exist within the Appalachian range. It's kind of cool though when you look at Roan Mountain, because you've got Roan High Knob, and that's just this really dense stand of spruce fir forest. But then when you just go over a hump or two, Round Bald and Jane, it's all a grassy bald. No one really knows why that is the way it is, but it's pretty cool to be able to see that. And again, this is at the top of Roan in June when the rhododendrons are blooming. I tell people all the time I leave the best for last because I really do like the spruce fir forest. And this is one that we'll spend some time talking about too when we talk about the woodland plants. But this is basically going to be anything above that 5,500 foot. And you heard me mention earlier, we've got about 125 of those that are over 5,000 here in the southern Appalachians especially. But you can see the spruce and the fir are what dominate at those higher elevations. And again, that's remnants of the Ice Age when the glaciers brought these to us basically. So a lot of people refer to this as a boreal forest or a Canadian forest, and that's why, because it's very similar to what we would see in some of those temperate regions in our northern provinces. We've talked a lot about, again, how the Appalachian mountain range has deterred travel. So it was a great impediment to the settlers and the pioneers who wanted to move west, and it was when Daniel Boone actually discovered the Cumberland Gap, and you can kind of see there that wilderness, the Great Wilderness Roads, where it meets there at the junction of Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. So that was about 1775 when they happened upon this, and that became the road west up until about the early 1800s. To go along with that, the Cumberland Gap, this tunnel is pretty notorious there, right on the Kentucky-Tennessee line. This is only one of two big tunnels that cross state lines. The other one there is on Interstate 77, traveling from Virginia into West Virginia at the East River Tunnel. We have a lot of other pretty cool formations that we maybe don't necessarily think about here in Appalachia, but the greatest concentration of rock arches outside of that Colorado Plateau, or if anybody's ever been to Arches and Moab, Utah, the hottest place I've ever been in my life, by the way. But this is in Red River Gorge or Red River Canyon up in Slade, Kentucky. Really cool to see some of those formations. There's a natural bridge there in Kentucky. There's also a natural bridge in Virginia. So really neat to be able to see those formations. Again, we've talked about how these rivers were older than the mountains when they formed. So that's why we got these narrows and gorges and canyons that were all created. So this is actually the Grand Canyon of the South up in Breaks Interstate Park on the Virginia-Kentucky line. It is the deepest gorge in the east. It's almost 1,700 foot. Followed by the Linville Wilderness Gorge, and you can kind of see that. This is going to be really far extending, really far south, coming off of the Appalachian Range, moving into the Piedmont, North Carolina. So we're going to talk about some of these mysteries, the Brown Mountain Lights, if anybody's ever heard of those. We're going to talk about that toward the end of October in one of those classes. You've heard me mention Fontana Dam. It is the tallest dam east of the Rockies. It stands at 480 foot. It is part of the Tennessee Valley Authority's lakes, also known as the Great Lakes of the South. But again, it is the tallest concrete dam. The Appalachian Trail does cross this, and the entire northern border of Fontana Lake is actually the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So there's many hiking waypoints here that you can hike to get up into the Smokies. This is actually what I was talking about earlier with the road to nowhere, because this is not far from Fontana Dam out in Bryson City, North Carolina, but this was the road to nowhere. So along that northern flank of the lake, they would have access into the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So they basically just built 6 miles of the road and built this tunnel, and then they stopped. So once you get through the tunnel, you can access again Clingman's Dome, Nolan Divide Trail, Eagle Creek, Forney Creek, all of those travel. You can hike up the flank of Clingman's Dome from here. But this was where they encountered that Anakeesta rock. And so this entire chain from Fontana all the way up into the chimney tops and Charlie's Bunyan is all part of that same rock formation of Anakeesta. So they were afraid of being that close to the lake that the sulfuric acid would leach into the water and cause environmental concerns. And again, that's just another picture of the chimney tops. Another cool feature, you can see there, I think you can see that's off the coast of Virginia. I think they call that the southern shore of Maryland, but Assateague Island. So what does that have to do with the Appalachians? Well, at Virginia's Grayson Highlands State Park, they brought the wild ponies from Assateague Island here in 1975. So once a year, these are actually auctioned off. So they actually monitor the populations up there of the wild ponies. Mount Rogers, all of that's going to be in Virginia. These are slot canyons. A lot of people don't realize that the canyon lands in Utah aren't the only place with slot canyons. This is actually located in Lebanon, Virginia. It's just about 20 acres, but it's a pretty cool labyrinth, pretty cool formation there of these slot canyons that form. The cool thing about it, though, it's more green, if you can see, rather than being the desert of the American Southwest. This here again is Grandfather Mountain. You can see the face of him. Actually, wind has been recorded up there at over 120 miles sustained. So that was just a couple of years ago, actually in February of 2019. You heard me mention about the Cherokee being moved west on the Trail of Tears because of the gold rush, and Dahlonega, Georgia was the site of the very first gold rush in the United States, and you can actually see the gold coin was marked with a D until 1861, so they were still in mint production up until that time. This is Amicalola Falls in Dawsonville, Georgia. This is going to be the southern terminus of the Appalachian Trail. I pictured it here because it is considered to be the tallest waterfall east of the Mississippi at 720 foot. So pretty cool when it's flowing pretty freely in the springtime. And something else probably some of you are aware of, the Tail of the Dragon. That's the road on NC 129 or US 129 through Dills Gap. It follows from Fontana Dam all the way through the Little Tennessee River Valley, which is not the same as the Tennessee. This is the Little Tennessee, but it follows the Little Tennessee, and it's got 318 curves and 11 miles of road. So if you really want to check to see if you're car sick, or if you suffer from that, this would be the road to try that on. Or if you really just don't like somebody, take them for a Sunday drive on the Tail of the Dragon. You can kind of see some of those hairpin turfs there, especially from the aerial view. So pretty cool to drive that. Of course, a lot of folks on motorcycles will drive the Tail of the Dragon. Not too far from that area, getting on into the further south, is the Joyce Kilmer Memorial Forest. This was actually, or is one of the only virgin forests still left in the southern Appalachians. You can actually, whoops, where'd I go there? You can actually see that, what a lot of locals will call slick rock, but it's an extension coming out of the southern part of the Great Smoky Mountains. So I'm going to kind of conclude with saying that we do, in fact, hopefully, this will just serve as a very brief introduction to how diverse and beautiful our landscape really is within the Appalachian range. And a lot of things have impacted us through time, but you know, we as humans have been resilient. A lot of our flora and fauna species have. It's amazing to see what has survived through so much, or what we still are taking from the mountains, you know, just what they do in fact give us. So you know, as a hiker, that old saying, leave no trace, and we certainly don't want to do that on the trails, but we do want to leave a trace in the generations to come, and really encourage them to get outdoors and see what, you know, what this great mountain range really does have to offer.